And Ashley, to the question, can you receive the recording? Yes, and we'll have it up on the website too, where you can grab it if you want to. So there's a couple options there. So again, good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, especially Mark Paul, who's graciously agreed to give this wonderful book talk and hold a conversation with us at Jubilee School, which is the political education wing of the Debt Collective. Debt Collective is the nation's first debtors union. We are probably most known for our organizing around student loan debt, but we also have campaigns around housing debt, carceral debt, medical debt, K through 12 lunch debt. Yes, that actually exists, and a host of other types. We also are offering these political education sessions, which we're thrilled to have Mark with us here for tonight. I do want to say before we get too far in that our next session is in Jubilee School is next week, and it is on the Massachusetts victory of a tax on millionaires. Is important because that money that they won in that tax victory is going to fund things like public higher education, K through 12 education. So please join us next week if you're interested. Hello, Janelle. We're just getting started. So nice timing. We are recording. So if you want to not be on the camera, please change your name. But we're here with Mark Paul. Mark's going to talk about his book, also talk to us about economic freedoms. I'm super curious to talk about freedom in debt. This is a big interest of mine in the way that debt, at least in my view, curtails, delimits freedom, especially free time. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of that stuff. But we want to make sure that we have time for question and answers with everyone here. And so the way that this is going to work is Mark's going to talk for 25, 30 minutes at the most, and then we'll open things up for dialogue. And we plan to be done around 9 o'clock or so, given that we're starting at 8:07, probably a little bit after. And that's 9 o'clock Eastern time. So without further ado, I'm going to let Mark introduce himself and his project and the book. And if at any time you want to record a question or want to say anything, please type in stack in the chat or put your question in the chat and I will get to it when time permits. So once more, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mark, and it's all you.
Thank you so much, Jason, and to the wonderful folks at the Debt Collective for hosting me this evening. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and I'm really looking forward to chatting about this wonderful book that you can pick up if you're interested. The Ends of Freedom: Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. Hopefully, picking up at your local independent bookstore if you have one. So, before I jump into the talking about the book, I just want to kind of frame things up and mention kind of my primary impetus for writing this book, which was that I think that we've really lost our way in the United States in terms of how we talk about the very idea of freedom. Now, freedom is perhaps the most powerful word that captures our political thoughts and discourse right now. Really controls our master narrative here in the United States. Yet the notion of freedom has been completely ceded to the right to mean little more than supposedly free markets and the freedom to work or starve, but really little else. Now, at the same time, I felt compelled to work towards developing a post-neoliberal agenda. And I'm sure many of you in this room have books on your bookshelf that talk about how neoliberalism is dead or dying or one nail in the coffin away. But what those books fail to do is then tell us what comes next. And I think if we want to move beyond neoliberalism, we need an emancipatory vision for what the economy can and should look like and how we can structure that. And so I wrote this book less to be a critique of our existing world, although that's kind of in part what I'll focus on today. But really more to provide that affirmative blueprint as a policy economist, thinking about what are the types of economic structures that will provide us meaningful and enduring freedom. And for those of you who are cringing right now because of what I just said, right? Enduring freedom is another great example. It's the code word for the war in, now I'm forgetting, I believe Afghanistan. that the right weaponized yet again. So they are just far better at messaging than we are. And that's something I think we actually really need to contend with quite seriously. So in 2017, Philip Alston, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, came to the United States during his time here. He crisscrossed the nation talking to people in California, Alabama, Georgia, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and more. And what he saw really shocked him. He met with people living here in Skid Row, which is one of the largest homeless encampments in the United States, which was just a block away from where I spent my year last year at University of Southern California in this beautiful downtown building, thanks to a project funded by a billionaire. And I would, walk during my lunch days around Skid Row and contemplate, is this the best we can do as a nation? And Philip Alston had the same thought, and he was shocked when he was meeting with people who had no teeth because for some reason teeth aren't covered by our health insurance system here in the United States. He met with people denied basic necessities such as clean water or a toilet or sufficient food or a safe place to lay their head at night. It was more akin to Alston to life in a refugee camp in a war-torn nation than one in the famed United States, the land of the free and home of opportunity. And so he was left wondering how a country like America could allow for the persistence of extreme poverty, a condition that really fundamentally undermines the very human rights of its citizens. And of course, the key question that arises is for what? Now, Alston was, unfortunately seeing nothing new for those of us that are, deeply familiar with inequality in the American daily lives. Um, but through this, you come to note, you come to see that America is a country of have and have nots. So, we know the United States is a deeply unequal society, but we're not an unequal society because of lack of resources or because inequality fuels robust economic growth. In fact, despite the popular narrative, economic growth was actually slower during the neoliberal era than it was during the 3 decades that preceded it. Nevertheless, we need to reckon with the fact that America is a incredibly rich country. Just to put some numbers on that, if wealth were distributed equally, not only, for instance, would we have no debt, right? The debt collective could call it quits and could go enjoy a little more leisure. But each and every one of us would have $500,000 to our name. If you're living with another adult, you'd be a millionaire. If income were distributed equally on top of that, you'd have just shy of $100,000 coming in on top of your wealth. Now, let's be real. You're not living the Jeff Bezos life in this scenario, but you're living enough to live the good life in my book. But of course, America's unprecedented wealth and income aren't distributed equally. That's not the economy policymakers have intentionally built. Instead, America is a tale of two countries, one experienced by the haves, where there's economic abundance, and one experienced by the have-nots, where there's persistent economic insecurity, which is just plaguing them day in and day out. And so then the question becomes, what is to be done? This is actually the question that drove me into economics. Most of us in this room are, largely familiar with a lot of the story I've shared so far. And of course, are also familiar with the 2008 financial crisis, which shook the nation to its core. And for me, one of the most positive developments that came out of the financial crisis and Occupy movement was kind of the rise of discussion around inequality and economic insecurity. Now, the goal of Occupy was to build an economy for the 99%. Here people were increasingly realizing that both poverty and extreme inequality were not necessities, but were mere policy choices. And for those of you following recent headlines, when we look at the new poverty numbers that came out, we see that poverty for children in the United States doubled this year. Why? Because of a stupid policy choice that we made, that we easily, could have decided differently. The world we live in didn't just arise naturally. It, including the markets that rule much of it, are not free markets. Rather, these were all planned into existence. But this idea of an economy of a 99% was a slogan. And I know lots of people push back at Occupy for where is your 10-point plan and what exactly do you want? And I don't share that. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that, for those of us who think deeply about policy matters, our job, I think, is to take those slogans and think about what would that actually look like. What would a well-being state, not just a welfare state, but a well-being state that centers people in the economy actually look like? Now, in comes 2015, and it is hard to overstate just how much the Overton window has shifted since then. But for those of you that remember, all the way back in 2015, you'll remember that when Senator Sanders came on the stage and introduced these radical ideas, things like healthcare as a right, college for all, $15 minimum wage and full employment. These ideas were, laughed out of the room. We were told that they would put us, as Frederick Hayek noted, on the high road to serfdom. You know, most of people thought, Sanders had good intentions, but good intentions don't translate to good policy. So I was interested in thinking about, were these ideas actually radical? Would they tank the economy, and have all these perverse incentives? And were they actually, and this is kind of, I think, the core place that my book makes a big contribution, were they actually a decisive break for the American tradition, amounting to a little more than an assault on the American understanding of freedom? Or did they have a deeper tie to the continued history for emancipatory freedom here in the United States? It was in my historical work that I came to, learn just how nuanced the discussion around freedom was. Indeed, there are really two flavors of freedom that we should be talking about. The whole notion of freedom being little more than free markets, which is precisely what neoliberals argue, was not, freedom hook, line, and sinker, but instead it was a particular type of freedom. It was what Isaiah Berlin, a philosopher, called negative freedom, which was freedom from constraint, freedom from government. Today we can look back at the Bill of Rights, which is, what guarantees us our negative freedoms, to see that this idea does indeed have deep roots in the American tradition. But the meaning of freedom has never been that simple. As I try to explore at length in the book, there is another form of freedom, positive freedom, which asks what the state owes each and every citizen as part of the social contract. We're familiar with many of these positive freedoms today. For instance, I'm sure many folks on this call send their kids to go get that free K through 12 education, which is thought of as a matter of right, and indeed is enshrined as a right in most state constitutions. But this notion of positive freedom, which we can think of in our education system, is also a notion that has been fought about since the very founding of this country. In fact, there's been a long American tradition that has fought for positive freedoms to provide people with a piece of the economic pie, not as charity, not as welfare, but as their right as a citizen who is participating in our country, our democracy, and our community. In fact, Berlin himself frequently pushed against the idea that negative freedom and isolation could be thought of as a meaningful form of freedom. He said, and I quote, "Men who are half naked, illiterate, underfed, and diseased need more than simple negative rights. Indeed, providing them with only political rights is to mock their condition." And I think that's exactly right. And that is the condition for far too many Americans today. And that is why I think that American freedom, at least in its hegemonic form, needs a rethink. So for those of you familiar, Frederick Hayek is often thought of the father of neoliberalism, but Milton Friedman is really its favorite son. Indeed, back in 1951, Friedman wrote a piece entitled "Neoliberalism and Its Prospects," recognizing the failures of the pure free market order. Like Hayek did in The Road to Serfdom, Friedman believed a mixed economy was in order, one where government, and I quote, relieved the acute misery and distress of the poor. He also added things that we needed powerful enforcement of antitrust laws to ensure competitive marketplaces. And I say this because people like Friedman and Hayek are often taken today to be, exclusively for free markets and really for no government intervention. But in fact, Milton Friedman called for a minimum income for all. And he told us that, a new faith was going to be on offer that he coined to be neoliberalism, which he thought was going to be a far cry from the laissez-faire free market system that so failed this nation during the Great Depression. Friedman and Hayek were really trying to sell a middle road, really basically what blue dog Democrats and Republicans stood for most of our lives. Now, in time, Friedman would actually become radicalized and would turn into the, true free marketeer that we know and speak of today. But it's interesting to think about his early beginnings really were to develop neoliberalism as that middle path. Yet, clearly, it strayed quite far from it. So, in my work, I focus not just on thinking about the history of neoliberalism, but I also try to spend time thinking about the history of positive freedom, which gets really short shrift in American history, I think, and it's to all of our own detriments. I try to develop a comprehensive prescription for the problem of persistent economic insecurity in the US based on this expanded notion of freedom. I firmly argue that the United States can eradicate poverty and build an economy that works for everybody by adopting social and economic rights, commonly referred to as positive rights. Things like the right to a well-paying job, the right to healthcare, the right to education, and more. Now, these rights are deeply American, indeed have been part of the American conversation since the very founders. Here on the left, we have Thomas Paine, perhaps the most radical of the founders, who first introduced the idea that the collective pie should go to each and every American as a matter of their birthright. Indeed, Paine, who argued in Common Sense that we should actually have basic wealth transfers to each and every person in the United States, and that we should get state funded life events, so things like weddings, births, deaths, etc., should all be paid for by the state, bringing you both into and out of this democratic community. And he would actually go on to call for a basic income for all to share in the wealth. So Paine was really, I think, an underappreciated and quite radical voice. Similarly, Hamilton is one of the founders who should be understood as really the founder of industrial policy, where Hamilton argued forcefully that it was the state's responsibility to provide all with what he called the means proper, which was basically the building blocks to lead a good life. But it was perhaps Lincoln who worked to enact positive rights into law to the greatest extent through policies like the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, and others that created our modern education system, founded on the notion that education should be free and accessible to all, and the idea that everybody is entitled to land. Now, I want to be clear here, this was based in a vision of settler colonialism that was very clearly displacing communities to take that land for essentially largely white European descended men. However, he did have this vision that for citizens, for American citizens, that we should have a right to the means of production, essentially. And indeed, Lincoln actually went a step further, enacting the promised 40 acres and a mule, providing true economic opportunity for the previously enslaved. Now, unfortunately, Lincoln would be assassinated, which brought Andrew Johnson into power, who abruptly ended Reconstruction, repealing the land redistribution program and stripping previously enslaved people of any hopes of true economic security. Now, in comes, perhaps my favorite American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And in Roosevelt's 1944 State of the Union address, he called for an economic Bill of Rights. And it was really Roosevelt's championing of these rights in his 11th State of the Union address that would solidify this idea of economic rights in American history. And indeed, this idea has unfortunately, I think, also gotten far too little attention throughout American history. We talk frequently of the New Deal, but we fail to talk about the fact that Roosevelt's real vision was cradle to grave security for all people. And in order to provide people with that freedom, what he would call their freedom from want, we needed to enact an economic Bill of Rights. For Roosevelt, this wasn't, this was really the culmination of the New Deal. It was the cherry on top for all the victories that, the American working class had won. And let's also be clear in this room that, Roosevelt didn't come here by himself. He was pushed to adopt these ideas by a powerful and militant labor movement that really helped sway Roosevelt's domestic policy agenda. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died before he was able to enact these economic rights into law, despite calling on Congress to do so. He passed away just a mere year after calling for an economic Bill of Rights. But the idea of economic rights didn't die with Roosevelt. Indeed, this idea would live on within the civil rights movement. And indeed, after Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement helped secure the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 65 Voting Rights Act, the civil rights movement, really under King's leadership, along with other more progressive members of the movement like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, really pushed their attention full time to economic rights. Indeed, the 1966 Freedom Budget, which if you haven't read it, go spend an hour to check it out. It is just one of the most powerful documents written in American history, called essentially for economic rights. And we often forget the March on Washington, right, which was truly the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, was calling for things like housing for all, education for all, food and full employment for all. Yet when we talk about the famed March on Washington today, all we talk about are civil and political rights. We leave out the more radical side of it, the demand for economic rights. In their development of the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 is really when the fight for economic rights took off. And indeed, a little known fact that I like to share is King's final piece of writing, which he wrote just before his untimely assassination and was published after his murder, was entitled, "We Need an Economic Bill of Rights." And that was the central demand of the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. Now, after King's assassination, his intellectual and life partner, Coretta Scott King, continued this fight, and she actually helped solidify the win of the 1978 Humphrey-Hawkins Act, which actually gives the Federal Reserve of the United States their current dual mandate, where they have to both balance supposed full employment and steady prices. So this brings us back to today. Economic rights had really fallen off the agenda in Washington after the civil rights movement came to an end. And, unfortunately, I think as we have kind of fought to think about what is the vision to replace neoliberalism, what we've largely ended up with is a laundry list of wants, which have fundamentally, I think, lacked a coherent narrative, and in particular, a coherent narrative grounded in American history to help articulate what exactly it is that we are striving for, what connects, right, debt abolition to a Green New Deal to health care for all. What is that connective tissue? And so what I set out to try to develop in the book, drawing on Roosevelt and King's work, amongst others, is, as Keynes puts it, a society that should be ethically tolerable and economically not intolerable. And so, in the bulk of the book, I go through the various economic rights listed here, things like the right to work, right to housing, education, income, a union, and more. And what I try to do in each chapter is really three things. I try to connect this idea to the long fight for freedom in the American tradition. And I think that this is quite important because, look, if I talk to people who regularly read Dissent or Jacobin, they're largely already in agreement. But the question for me is, how do we broaden our political tent to try to bring more people into these movements and try to get more people excited about progressive politics and policy? And I think to do that, I do think we need to lean into a little bit of an American story. The second thing I do, given that this is an education school, is I try to debunk the common neoliberal wisdom in terms of why is, say, giving healthcare free to everybody a bad idea. I break down those economic arguments and explain why they're deeply misguided. And the third most important part of each chapter, I really flesh out the positive economic case of why, for instance, a right to a free education, a debt-free education, is not only good for the individual, but is good for our society and our economy. And this part is crucial for us to be able to, articulate, to convince others, and to just converse with others about why these ideas matter so much. Now, debt actually gets a bit of short shrift in the book. I want to be upfront about that. But the point here of these economic rights is that if you have these rights, debt is no longer going to be a significant or hopefully a part of the conversation at all, right? When you look at what's driving most debt, as Jason talked about at the top, it's healthcare debt, it's education debt, it's, school lunch debt. I mean, when we move all of these things out of the marketplace, we no longer have to worry about going into debt to meet our basic human rights and to live that good life. Now, the vision that I have here in terms of what we do with markets is that sometimes markets work decently well. I'm not arguing we should abolish markets. I'm arguing that, you should be able to go to the grocery store and pick from the 27 different types of cereals what kind of cereal you want. But in some areas, markets simply do not belong. Healthcare or education being two examples. These are areas that we just need to flat out decommodify and to say that these are areas that should be run through the democratic process, provided publicly to all, and indeed the market, who has the biggest ability to pay, should not have any say over who lives and who dies or who receives an education. The other thing that I'm really trying to articulate in the book is that we need to bound markets, right? So we frequently talk about floors in markets. The floor you're all probably most familiar with is a minimum wage. But if there's unemployment, right, the minimum wage is still effectively zero for the unemployed worker. So how do we actually provide high quality base employment available to anybody who is willing and able to work? That's a true floor in the market. But we also have to talk about ceilings. How do we bound markets from the top? And that's what I want to talk about briefly next before concluding. So there's the inevitable, how do you pay for it question. These ideas all sound great, but we can't afford it. We're going to go into too much debt. When people ask, how do you pay for it? I don't want to brush that aside. It's a serious question that we must take seriously. But I contend that there are two parts of the question that we need to differentiate. The first part of the question is, where will the dollars come from? And I contend in the book that's actually the easy part. The second question, the question I think progressives need to give much deeper thought to, is where will the real resources come from? In other words, if we want universal health care, we are going to need a lot more hospital janitors and doctors and nurses and the like. Or if we want to transition off fossil fuels, we are going to need a shitload of electricians and electric vehicle, manufacturing sites and wind technicians and the like. And how are we going to retool our economy to deliver these important human ends that we need? That is a challenging question. But let me spend the rest of the time talking about that first question. That's the one that I think most people get hung up on. How do we pay for it? We pay for it through a number of mechanisms. The first question is, are your taxes going to go up? And you know what? For most of us, yes, they are. And this is where I admittedly still struggle, but I think that we desperately need to develop better language on how to talk about this. Let me use myself as an example. Your taxes can go up, but you can still be economically better off at the end of the day. I have a good job. I am a professor. I pay $830 a month for my health insurance premium. Now, if my taxes go up under a Medicare for All program, and I might have to pay $400 a month more in taxes, my tax bill went up. But guess what? I have more money in my pocket at the end of the day, and I no longer need to switch insurances. I counted, this is not a fun exercise, I counted 13 times in my fairly young adult life. I'm not that old yet. And let me tell you, it sucks each and every time you change. So yes, can your taxes go up and you be still financially better off and more financially secure? Absolutely. But it's true that for things like Medicare for All, some taxes will go up, but I would contend, and we've crunched the numbers, that most people, most Americans, particularly low and middle income Americans, will have more money in their pocket at the end of the day. More disposable income, that's what we call it. The second thing is we need to tax the rich. And this is where I was talking about ceilings earlier. Roosevelt introduced what I thought was a brilliant idea that hasn't been brought back up in far too long. And maybe it's time we get a bill introduced in Congress on this, talking about not just a minimum income, but a maximum income. Indeed, Roosevelt called for the equivalent of a maximum income to $450,000 today. We have these brave members of Congress like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez get laughed out of the room for talking about a 70% top marginal tax rate, which, mind you, is not only lower than it was under the Republican Eisenhower, but is lower than mainstream economic theory finds as optimal, published in top econ journals. They actually argue it should be in the mid-80s. Nevertheless, I would contend it should be 100, because our goal isn't just to maximize the size of the economic pie, but it's also to protect our democracy. And if we want to protect our democracy, we need to encapsulate our democracy from the power of the rich. And that means taxing them so they do not have the degree of power they do today. The final area is increase in government debt. Many of these investments will pay off big time in the long run. Just to give you one example, studies find that investments in early childhood education provide $8 return on the investment. We can and we should increase government debt to invest in our people and to provide people with opportunities for the good life. At the end of the day, the real constraints are not the dollars and cents, but rather the real resources needed to meet our national priorities. As John Maynard Keynes once said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Thank you.
Bravo, Mark. Thank you so much. That was incredibly clear and concise. And you covered a lot of ground. Let's open up the room for questions and discussion. There's a million things that struck me during your talk, and I can't wait to read this book. If you would like to ask a question, if you could just simply type the word stack in the chat. That's the easiest way I can keep track. If you want to raise your hand, I can also do that, and I might miss it, but hopefully I'll catch it. Does anyone have any questions to ask Mark? And Michelle's asking, is this your first book?
It is. Yeah. Thanks for asking, Michelle. First book was a great pleasure to write, and not sure if there will be another yet. We'll see.
The follow-up. Other questions? While we're waiting, Mark, if you don't mind me asking, there's so much here that I was struck by. Just one comment, actually, that I really appreciated was in Debt Collective, we often do talk about debt abolition, debt cancellation, but there is this issue of like the positive project, right? And I want to say that in the struggle for student debt cancellation, one could argue that this has come back to maybe haunt us a little bit, because there is a legitimate question out there coming from the right and from the center around the fact of, well, if you cancel student loans, what prevents the loans from coming back because the high cost of college? And we do have responses to that, and there's ways to talk about that, but there is an argument to be made that by doubling down so hard on cancellation and not talking about the other side of that being free university, free public higher education, something like a college for all plan, et cetera, we do face this dilemma. And maybe that would have helped us mobilize in different ways, and perhaps opened up some different strategic terrains if we had done both and at the same time. So I really appreciate that point. I do have a question, and hopefully other people will have some other questions as well. What do you make of the argument that I've seen from people like Nancy Fraser or others saying that your question that you start off about what comes after neoliberalism, that there's this huge gap, and that one of the things that's happening is the right-wing authoritarians are filling that gap. In other words, neoliberalism is falling apart, and the left hasn't necessarily figured out a way to do a lot of what you're doing, I think, to talk about, okay, what does come next? But what do you make of this idea that maybe the right-wing populism or right-wing authoritarianism, fascism, is indeed right now filling that gap, and we're at a really critical moment where we need to reverse that? What do you think of that?
I think it's absolutely right. And I think this is why we saw so many Bernie Trump voters. I think that people are feeling frustrated, people are feeling fed up, and the kind of right-wing strongman narrative is feeding into that frustration and anger, which I think is largely grounded in the fact that look, for my parents' generation, 96% of them were economically better off than their parents. For my generation, less than half of us are. The American dream is dead. Right. And let's be real, the American dream never applied to everybody, first of all. But second of all, the American dream, as we, were promised, it just is no longer available to us. And so I think that people are searching for answers. And I think that Democrats in general have focused on marginal tweaks, right? This is what Hillary Clinton's whole campaign was about. And this is, what Joe Biden largely stands for, although I honestly, will say that he has pleasantly surprised me in some areas. Once elected, I think the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, was a fantastic win. And I do think often on the left, we don't celebrate wins enough. I'm not saying it's enough, right? It's a down payment is how I think about it on addressing the issue. But nevertheless, I think we need to celebrate wins. But I agree that the right has done a far better job engaging angry voters and frustrated voters. And I think it's because they're offering answers. Now, are they offering answers that are going to deliver for these people? Of course not. But they're meeting them where they are far better, right? The idea that if we only make a 529 savings plan a little bit more enticing, college is going to be fine. That's not resonating with most people. And that's what Democrats are focusing on. And I think that that's a major mistake. Even in the Inflation Reduction Act, huge bill, fantastic bill. But at the end of the day, it's a tax cut bill. It's all about tax breaks. And there too, I think that it's hard for a lot of people to grasp, to latch onto that. It's not a kitchen table issue to talk about, did you file the paperwork for that tax credit? And so I think that, we need a progressive populist economic message. And that's precisely what I lean into here. Now, I will say one critique people can make of my book is that I lean into the American story perhaps a bit too much. And, for me, the question is, how do we convince voters in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan to kind of join this progressive movement? And that's precisely why I do that. I think that, people are proud to be American. And I think that providing them with a narrative that bridges it to the progressive movement is very important.
Thank you. Margaret and or Michelle, do you sorry, do you want to read your question or say your question out loud rather than having me talk the whole time?
I can say my question. It's Margaret. Wondering if either one of you have talked with anyone from DM25 in Europe. Their agenda is broadly similar. They are like a pan-European group of economically, politically, and socially progressive people. And they have a lot of content online. They have a lot of prominent people in their organization. Bernie's synced up with them a few times. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Mark?
Thank you, Margaret, for that question.
Thank
I know
you.
Yanis Varoufakis, and we've talked a few times, but I haven't spoken with them at length kind of on these ideas, and we haven't linked up and kind of done any joint events yet, but it's a great idea. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Margaret, thank you. I know of them, but I haven't spoken with them. So thanks for the recommendation. Michelle, would you like to read your question? No, okay. The question coming from Michelle was if you could say a little bit more about what encouraged you or what impacted you to write The Ends of Freedom. It's a nice question because oftentimes when we do debtor assemblies, we start with the debtor narrative and the debtor testimony about that brought them to talk about their debt in public. And maybe you could say a little bit about what brought you to write the content, especially around, it's pretty heavy, it can be really concept, heavy concept of freedom, right? So like, yeah, what got you to write that?
Let me back up actually and just say, I wasn't born wanting to be an economist. I actually want to, thanks to public broadcasting, I fell in love with food. Julia Childs, when I was 14, started teaching me how to cook. I grew up on like DiGiorno pizza and bagel bites, which was not very good. And thanks to PBS, I fell in love with food and I started working in kitchens. And that's what actually got me kind of initially interested in economics, was working in kitchens at fairly high-end restaurants and seeing largely immigrants who had worked in the restaurant for 6-7 years, shown up 52 weeks a year, 60 hours a week, and they couldn't make ends meet. And no way in hell could they or I ever afford to, bring our partners or family to the restaurants we were cooking in. That was way out of reach. And that got me really reflecting on, economic opportunity in the United States. And that was my first turn to economics. But, look, I went to culinary school and community college and took a very different path. In terms of this book, what really invigorated me was working on the Sanders 2015 campaign. I was in a very privileged position where I was finishing my PhD at the time, and I was working directly with his chief policy advisor and the senator himself quite frequently as a policy assistant, helping develop their policy platform, talking points, articulate it to the public. And what I saw was that Sanders just got slaughtered by economists, and his ideas just got completely debunked, or not debunked, but derailed is the word I was looking for in the popular press, and that there weren't enough kind of progressive economic voices out there making the case for these ideas and really articulating why these ideas do indeed make economic sense, as long as you're not a 0.1%. And that's really where I turned my attention. And admittedly, I was a bit frustrated with the Sanders campaign for lacking what I thought was a coherent narrative on the economy, right? I do think they fell into the laundry list struggle. And I think he struggled to articulate it. And I also think he struggled to connect it to the American story. You can't just point to Finland and Norway and say, look how great they do it. We should do that. I mean, we should learn from our neighbors. I'm all for it. But in terms of like actually articulating it to the American people, we need to be, I think, a bit more intentional. And, hey, I don't know if I have all the answers, but I this was my best shot at it.
Yeah, and I find this to be really compelling, actually, the idea that the freedom narrative could be the through line. Maybe one more question before we leave, unless someone else has another question. But I'm often interested in the discussion of freedom in the country, but then I'm also interested in hearing how, or often not, the question of equality gets either not considered alongside freedom or actually does play a role in the way we conceive of freedom. I'm curious if you do discuss equality as well, and what's the connection between freedom and equality, and does that also play a role in maybe some of the shaping of the narrative?
It's such a good question, and to be honest, it's not one I contend with probably enough in the book. Um, where I contend with this in my own thinking is getting to that idea of, what is the role of the market? And,
Mm.
what I was trying to articulate is that I think it's really important that we bound markets, that we set decent floors in markets. So that
Mm.
means, a job guarantee to actually eradicate unemployment, social housing to ensure that we have high quality housing for everybody, a public option, sorry, not a public option, universal healthcare program, et cetera, that we have all of these programs to set not low quality programs for the poor, right? As Wilbur Ross, who was one of the chief architects of the New Deal, quipped, programs for the poor make poor programs. And I could not agree more. And this is precisely why, yes, we should pay for Donald Trump's kids to go to college. We
Mm.
need high quality public programs that are thought of as the golden star.
Mm.
Um, and at the same time, we need to bound the market, through things like a extremely progressive wealth tax and perhaps a limit, a maximum income.
Mm.
And through that, we start providing some degree of equality. I mean, for me, I don't know, I'm quite blunt about this in the book. I don't know what the right number, for instance, a maximum income is when we start thinking about, okay, what degree of equality and inequality do we want in a society? I don't have a real answer to that yet. Let's say we set a minimum income in the United States at, $50,000. What is the maximum income? Is it $250,000? Is it $500,000? Is it 2 million? I definitely don't think it's more than $1 million personally, but I'm not sure where that right
Mm.
number is. I mean, I would probably contend it's something like, I don't know, 5 to 1. I think we should think of this as a ratio. Um, but those are the types of discussions that I hope that the book elicits, that we need to be talking about this more as a democratic nation, to think about what degree of equality and inequality do we want to tolerate that is actually healthy for a real democracy. Because what we know is that the degree of inequality today that we have does nothing more than erode democracy. And this is why the link between economic equality and democracy, I think, is so important and so underappreciated.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I want to put in the chat one more time a link to Mark's book. I also want to say, Mark, I do look forward to getting my hands on this and then teaching it to the students that I teach at the university level. I think if your lecture here, today's discussion, is any indication, this is an extremely clarifying work that would do wonders for folks in classrooms. So I hope that it does get picked up in that way. Unless
Thank
anyone
you so
has any
much.
other questions, sorry, maybe we can wrap things up. Any other thoughts or questions?
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I really appreciate this. For those who've asked, there will be a recording available to people on the Debt Collective's website. And please join us for future Jubilee Schools. This has been really fantastic. And everybody stay safe, stay strong, and stay in the struggle. See you around.